The last of the New Orleans twilight bled from the sky, painting the narrow streets in bruised purples and deep, inky blues. Sophia Reed clutched her worn canvas bag closer, the familiar weight of her sketch pad and charcoal a small comfort against the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Another double shift at the diner had left her bone-tired, but the exhaustion was a familiar companion, almost a shield against the deeper ache of loneliness. At 21, a lifetime in the foster system had taught her to be invisible, to expect little, and to dream in quiet, unassuming ways. A tiny studio, perhaps, bathed in sunlight, where she could paint without fear of interruption or judgment. She picked up her pace, the humid air heavy and still, a prelude to the storm that always seemed to hang over the city. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every rustle of leaves sounded like a whisper. Sophia was acutely aware of the dangers that lurked in the city's underbelly, a primal fear that had been ingrained in her since childhood, making her wary of every stranger, every fleeting glance. Tonight, that fear felt like a cold hand tightening around her heart. A sudden, brutal force slammed into her from behind. Air rushed from her lungs in a choked gasp. A rough hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream, and another pinned her arms. The world spun, a dizzying blur of dark alley walls and the glint of something metallic. A sickly, sweet scent filled her nostrils, and then a crushing darkness swallowed her whole. She felt herself being lifted, dragged, a limp ragdoll, into the back of a vehicle, the last thread of consciousness fraying to nothing. When Sophia next surfaced, it was through a haze of nausea and disoriented terror. Her head throbbed, her limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, and a metallic taste coated her tongue. The air was cold and stale, thick with the scent of dust and desperation. She lay curled on a rough concrete floor, surrounded by other women, their faces pale and tear-streaked, their eyes wide with the same paralyzing fear that now gripped her. They were in a vast, ominous warehouse, the only light filtering through grimy, high-set windows, casting long, distorted shadows. The metallic clang of a distant door echoed, and a shudder ran through the huddled figures. Rough hands seized her, yanking her upright. Sophia cried out, a weak, pathetic sound, as she was propelled forward, her legs barely obeying. She stumbled onto a makeshift stage, glaring lights blinding her, revealing the monstrous faces of the bidders below. Men, all men, their eyes glinting with a predatory hunger that made her stomach churn. A numbered auction paddle was thrust into her trembling hand, its cold plastic a stark reminder of her new reality. She was property, an object. The auctioneer's voice boomed, amplified by cheap speakers, rattling the very bones in her chest. He described her assets, her youth, her perceived innocence, as if she were a prize animal. Sophia's gaze swept over the grotesque collection of men, her mind reeling, each face a fresh wave of paralyzing fear, reminding her of every man who had ever made her feel powerless, trapped. Her breath hitched, her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to burst. This was hell, a waking nightmare, and there was no escape. Just as a particularly corpulent man, his face a leering mask of greed, raised his paddle to make a bid, a chilling hush fell over the room. It wasn't a gradual fade, but an immediate palpable silence, as if the very air had been sucked out. All eyes, including Sophia's, snapped to the wide warehouse doors. A man stood framed in the entrance, a silhouette against the last vestiges of twilight outside. He was tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and his presence alone was an immediate, undeniable force of absolute power. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing with authority as he moved further into the room. His face was a chiseled mask, cold and unyielding, his eyes like chips of glacial ice as they swept over the terrified women, over the hushed bidders, before finally landing on Sophia. She didn't know who he was, but a primal part of her knew he was something formidable, something utterly dangerous. He was not there to bid for her, she realized, her instincts screaming, but to command. Cain Volkov's gaze, cold and sharp as polished obsidian, settled on Sophia. She felt it like a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the last vestiges of air from her lungs. He didn't just look at her, he saw her. Truly saw the raw, exposed terror she tried to hide. It was a look that stripped away her defenses, laying bare the quivering bird inside. The auctioneer, usually so boisterous, stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, a puppet whose strings had been abruptly cut. Then Cain spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath her feet. It was a sound of absolute command, a deep, unwavering certainty that silenced every other thought in her head. "She's mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and decisive. It wasn't a question nor a bid in the conventional sense. It was a declaration, a statement of ownership that brooked no argument. A collective gasp rippled through the stunned bidders, quickly followed by a murmuring hum of disbelief and fear. Cain didn't wait for a response. He named a figure, a sum so astronomically high it stole Sophia's breath, a number that meant nothing to her beyond its sheer intimidating power. It wasn't about the money, she realized with a chilling certainty. It was about asserting his will, about crushing any thought of competition. He was not buying her, he was claiming her. He was buying her, she instinctively understood, to protect her from the worst monsters in this room, from the men whose eyes still lingered on her with grotesque hunger. Sophia stood paralyzed, a fragile bird caught in a hawk's shadow. The plastic auction paddle, a symbol of her horrific objectification, slipped from her numb fingers, clattering on the makeshift stage with a surprisingly loud sound in the echoing silence. Cain moved then, his powerful stride purposeful, unhurried, yet unstoppable. Each step brought him closer, and with each step, the air around him seemed to thicken with his formidable presence. His eyes, still fixed on her, were like steel, revealing nothing but an unwavering resolve. He reached the edge of the stage, his immense height dwarfing her. He didn't offer a hand, didn't ask. His hand simply closed around her arm, his grip firm and possessive, not overtly rough, but utterly unyielding. It was a touch that marked her, branded her as his in front of every stunned, terrified bidder. Her body stiffened at the contact, a jolt of alarm shooting through her. But the sheer force of his will was a physical thing, pulling her off the stage, guiding her through the hushed crowd. She stumbled, her legs still weak, but he held her steady, a living, breathing anchor in the terrifying storm. Around them, a flurry of motion erupted. Cain's men, grim-faced and efficient, moved with chilling swiftness, securing the warehouse, their movements precise and ruthless. Sophia was a dazed passenger, her mind struggling to process the abrupt shift in her nightmare. She was still terrified, convinced she had simply traded one hell for another, a smaller cage for a larger, more imposing one. She was ushered into a waiting armored car, its interior surprisingly plush, but still feeling like a prison. Cain followed, settling into the seat beside her. He was a wall of intimidating masculinity, radiating an aura of cold power that consumed the confined space. The scent of him, clean and sharp, filled her senses, overwhelming the lingering stench of fear and dust from the auction house. He didn't offer comfort, no gentle words or reassurances. His voice, when he spoke, was low and stark, a quiet command that left no room for interpretation. "You belong to me now," he said, his gaze unwavering, pinning her in place. "And you will be safe." Her fear was still immense, a raw, throbbing pulse in her veins. She was still a captive, still an object of his will. Yet as his words settled over her, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something unidentifiable began to stir deep within her. It was a strange, primal sense of security, a nascent understanding that in the face of his formidable presence, in the absolute certainty of his command, She was no longer adrift. She was claimed, and perhaps for the first time in a very long time, she was no longer utterly alone against the monsters of the world. The armored car, a silent, imposing beast, glided through the rain-slicked streets of New Orleans, its tinted windows offering Sophia only fleeting, distorted glimpses of the city's shadowed grandeur. She sat rigid beside Kane, every muscle tensed, the sheer force of his presence a suffocating weight in the confined space. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile the terror of the auction with the strange, unasked-for protection he now offered. She was no longer being sold, but she was still claimed, still utterly at his mercy. The car finally slowed, turning onto a long, winding drive, obscured by ancient live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. Through the downpour, a structure emerged. Vast and dark against the stormy sky, Kane Volkov's mansion. It was a decaying Gothic masterpiece, a fortress of stone and shadow, overlooking the churning Mississippi. Iron gates, ornate and imposing, swung open silently, revealing manicured but somehow somber grounds. The scale of it overwhelmed her, a towering monument to power, cold and unyielding. Rain lashed against the iron balcony railings, a mournful sound that echoed the storm in her heart. This was not a home, it was a stronghold, and she was now inside its formidable walls. Inside, the mansion was a labyrinth of hushed opulence. Flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows across grand halls, adorned with heavy tapestries and dark, polished wood. Kane moved through it with the effortless grace of a predator in his own domain, his towering frame leading the way. Sophia followed, her legs still unsteady, feeling impossibly small and insignificant in the cavernous space. Every echo of her footsteps seemed too loud, every breath a betrayal of the pervasive silence. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind a tangled mess of fear and confusion, but she dared not falter. He led her to a lavish bedroom, a room larger than any apartment she had ever known, filled with heavy, dark furniture and a colossal four-poster bed draped in rich velvet. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it felt less like an invitation and more like another, more gilded cage. Kane turned to face her, his eyes, those chips of glacial ice, locking onto hers. His voice, low and precise, cut through the quiet. "You will not leave this room without my permission. You will always be accompanied by one of my men if you are permitted to leave the room. You will follow my commands without question." His tone was absolute, leaving no room for argument, no space for defiance. It was a cold, stark outline of her new existence. Her stomach clenched, but she found herself nodding, a silent, automatic submission. There was no other option. Yet beneath the chilling authority of his words, she sensed a layer of meticulous protection, a demanding insistence that every physical need would be met, that her safety was paramount, even if it meant her freedom was gone. Later, after a bath drawn by a silent maid and a meal she barely tasted, Sophia found herself alone in the vast room, wrapped in a silk robe that felt impossibly soft against her skin. She was a prisoner, yes, but a comfortable one, a paradox that twisted in her gut. From her window, she could see the relentless rain, hear the distant rumble of the river. She watched Kane from a distance over the next few days, catching glimpses of him through open doorways, always surrounded by his grim-faced men. He was a force of nature, his power undeniable, terrifying. She noticed the meticulous security, the guards posted at every door, the subtle clicks of locks, the way his men moved with quiet efficiency. It was a constant, impenetrable shield around the mansion, around her. His world was harsh, dangerous, built on command and fear, utterly alien to her gentle nature. Yet, within that formidable structure, she began to perceive a strange truth. He had chosen to keep her safe. He had claimed her, yes, but in doing so, he had drawn a line in the sand, marking her as his to protect, even if that protection came at the cost of her liberty. Her fear remained a constant companion, but a nascent, unsettling sense of security, born from his absolute control, began to take root. Days blurred into a strange, unsettling routine within the imposing walls of Cain Volkov's mansion. Sophia found herself navigating a paradox. She was a prisoner, yet every physical need was anticipated and met with a chilling efficiency. The initial paralyzing terror slowly began to recede, replaced by a dull ache of resignation. She still struggled with the reality of her captivity, the constant awareness of the guards, the silent understanding that her movements were entirely dictated by Cain's unspoken will. But with each passing hour, a peculiar comfort began to emerge from the very structure he imposed. She no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from, or if she would be safe walking home in the dark. Decisions, once a constant low-level hum of anxiety in her independent but precarious life, were now entirely absent. Cain had taken that burden from her, and in its place, a strange, unexpected peace started to settle. His men, equally intimidating in their grim efficiency, treated her with a curious reverence. Their eyes, though watchful, held a deferential quality, a clear reflection of Cain's possessiveness. She was his, and therefore untouchable by them. Sophia found herself yielding to his authority, not just out of fear, but because in her submission she found an odd, primal sense of safety. It was easier, less frightening to simply obey. One evening, as the last light of dusk painted the grand dining hall in shades of bruised violet, Cain summoned her. He stood before her, a dark, formidable presence that swallowed the light, holding a small velvet box in his large hand. Sophia's heart thumped a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She braced herself, unsure what new command or requirement awaited her. He opened the box, revealing a collar of dark, rich velvet, subtly embroidered with a silver crest she vaguely recognized as his family's symbol. It was beautiful, luxurious, yet its purpose was unmistakable. "This," Cain stated, his voice a low rumble that resonated through her, "is yours." Sophia stared at it, a tremor running through her. It was a tangible marker, a clear, visible signal to the underworld, to anyone who might dare to challenge his claim that she was truly his. It was a symbol of her new status as his possession, yes, but also, she realized with a strange clarity, of her untouchable queen. Her breath hitched, but she met his gaze, a silent question in her eyes. Cain took the collar from the box, his fingers brushing the soft velvet. He stepped closer, his immense height casting her in shadow. Sophia instinctively tilted her head, a silent, trembling acceptance. His hands, large and powerful, settled gently around her neck. The cool metal of the clasp a faint shock against her skin as he fastened it. His touch was firm, possessive yet careful, as if she were made of fragile glass. The velvet settled, a soft weight against her throat, a constant reminder of her new reality, of his claim, and of the impenetrable shield he had thrown around her. Despite the gilded cage, Sophia still yearned for her art. In the quiet solitude of her lavish room, she would sketch furtively in a small, discarded notebook she had found, her fingers craving the familiar feel of charcoal on paper. She drew the mansion's intricate details, the play of light and shadow, anything to distract from the oppressive weight of her situation. She thought her secret was her own, a tiny rebellion. Then, one afternoon, a heavy wooden box appeared in her room. Inside, nestled on rich satin, were brand-new sketch pads, a full set of professional charcoals, pastels, and even a small empty canvas with a pristine set of oil paints. Sophia stared, her breath catching in her throat. Cain, she realized, had noticed. He had seen her quiet desperation, the silent yearning for the one thing that still connected her to herself. It was a small concession in the grand scheme of his control, a seemingly insignificant gesture, yet for Sophia, it was monumental. It was a sign that he saw a part of her beyond her usefulness, beyond the object he had claimed at auction. He saw her, Sophia Reed, the girl who dreamed of painting. The act was demanding in its own way, a silent command to continue creating within his domain. But it was also a profound validation. A wave of complex emotion washed over her, gratitude, fear, and a strange, burgeoning sense of being utterly cared for within his formidable control. She was no longer just a captive. She was his queen, and even her quiet passions were now under his protection. The mansion, vast and labyrinthine, slowly began to reveal its secrets to Sophia, though always under the unspoken caveat of Cain's dominion. Her days settled into a rhythm dictated by the house's imposing schedule, a routine she now accepted with a quiet resignation. She found herself exploring the grand, echoing halls, the ornate drawing rooms, and the sprawling library, always keenly aware of the discreet watch that followed her every move. The guards were omnipresent, yet silent, their watchful eyes a constant reminder of her status, but also of the impenetrable shield around her. Most evenings, Cain insisted she dine with him in the grand dining hall, a cavernous space where flickering candlelight danced across ancient portraits and gleamed on polished silver. The silence between them was often profound, punctuated only by the soft clinking of cutlery or the distant wail of a ship's horn from the river. He remained a formidable, almost unapproachable figure, his presence filling the room with an undeniable power that kept her on edge. Yet, a quiet dialogue had begun to emerge, mostly initiated by him. His questions were sparse, direct, often about her art, about the canvases she now worked on in her room. "What is that you're painting?" he would ask, his voice a low rumble across the vast table, his eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on her. She would describe the play of light on a crumbling stone wall or the vibrant chaos of a New Orleans street she remembered, and he would listen, his expression unreadable, yet with an intensity that made her feel truly seen. It was a strange intimacy, born not of affection, but of his possessive interest in her, in every facet of her existence within his world. One stormy evening, as the rain hammered against the tall windows, turning the world outside into a blurred watercolor, Sophia was halfway through describing a new sketch of a magnolia tree, its heavy blossoms against the dark wood of the mansion. Cain listened, a rare, almost contemplative silence hanging between them. Then the heavy oak doors of the dining hall swung open, and a man entered, his presence immediately commanding, even beneath Cain's formidable shadow. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Her fork clattered against her plate. It was Marco. Cain's trusted lieutenant, a man she had seen only in fleeting, intimidating glimpses around the mansion, was also her favorite regular from the diner. The man who used to sit at the counter, always ordering black coffee and a slice of pecan pie, who would over-tip generously and ask her about her art, his dark eyes holding a kindness she rarely encountered. Marco paused, his gaze meeting hers across the vast table, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression before he swiftly averted it, directing his attention to Cain. The realization hit Sophia like a physical blow, a sudden, cold wave washing over her. He wasn't just a regular customer, he was Cain's man. He had been sent to watch her, to observe her, even before the auction, before the nightmare had truly begun. Her initial shock morphed into a chilling understanding. Cain's interest in her, his intervention, had been premeditated, calculated. He hadn't stumbled upon her by chance. Cain, observing the subtle shift in Sophia's demeanor, in the way her eyes widened, merely raised an eyebrow at Marco, a silent dismissal that sent his lieutenant back into the shadows of the hall. Then his gaze returned to Sophia, piercing, unwavering. He knew she had recognized Marco. He knew she understood. "You're wondering why he was there," Kane stated, his voice devoid of emotion. A simple statement of fact. He leaned back in his chair, a king on his throne, his eyes never leaving hers. "He was watching you, keeping you safe even then." Sophia could only stare, a knot forming in her stomach. Safe? While she had been slinging hash and dreaming of a tiny studio. Kane continued, his words falling like cold stones, each one hitting with precise impact. "Your last foster mother," he began, and Sophia flinched, a wave of old hurts resurfacing. "She provided information, your routines. Her greed was significant." A fresh wave of betrayal, sharp and bitter, twisted in her gut. Her own foster mother, the woman who had promised to care for her, had sold her out. The world felt like it was crumbling around her again, but Kane wasn't finished. "The first buyer," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "The one who tried to bid on you before the auction even began, to circumvent the process. He's gone. Gone before he could lay a hand on you." Sophia gasped. A small, choked sound. "Executed." The word hung in the air, a chilling, brutal confirmation of Kane's ruthlessness, his absolute, unyielding power. Horror warred with something else, something deeply unsettling and profoundly primal. He had known, he had watched, he had eliminated a threat before she even knew it existed. The scale of his protection, the terrifying lengths he had gone to, even before he officially claimed her, was staggering. Her heart pounded, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She was horrified by the violence, by the cold-blooded efficiency. But beneath the terror, a strange, undeniable truth began to solidify. This man, this terrifying, dominant king, had taken her from one hell and placed her into another. Yes, but it was a hell he controlled, a hell where she was untouchable. She was a possession, a prize, but in his absolute possessiveness, in his demanding, ruthless protection, she realized with a chilling clarity that she was utterly safe under his absolute power. The revelation of Marco's true role and the brutal truth of Kane's preemptive protection had shaken Sophia to her core. The dining hall, once a place of quiet, unsettling intimacy, now felt charged with a new, heavier tension. She understood now that her life had been intricately woven into Kane's formidable world long before she was dragged to the auction block. She was not just a random victim, she was a target, and Kane had been her silent, dangerous guardian. This knowledge, while terrifying in its implications, also solidified something within her. A strange, unyielding certainty that if anyone could keep her safe from the monsters, it was him. News, insidious and pervasive, began to filter through the thick stone walls of the mansion, carried on the hushed tones of the guards, the subtle shifts in Kane's grim expression, and the way Marco's eyes would sweep the rooms with increased vigilance. Sophia didn't need to hear the explicit words to understand. The atmosphere itself crackled with a new, external threat. The trafficking ring, humiliated by Kane's audacious intervention, and a rival cartel whose own shadowy interests had been thwarted at the auction, were now actively seeking her. She was not just a girl, she was a symbol, the prize that had made the Volkov devil bleed money. Reclaiming her, they believed, would be a direct strike at Kane's absolute authority, a way to undermine the fearsome mafia king. Sophia felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The fear that had begun to dull, replaced by a strange sense of security, now flared anew. But its direction had shifted. It was no longer a vague, pervasive dread of her unknown captor. It was a sharp, focused terror of the world outside, of the very real, very dangerous men who wanted to drag her back into the abyss. She was the epicenter of a brutal territorial war, a pawn in a game far beyond her comprehension. But this time, she had a protector. Kane's response was immediate and absolute, a chilling demonstration of his power. The mansion, already a fortress, transformed into an impenetrable stronghold. More guards appeared, their numbers seemingly doubling overnight, their presence a constant, formidable barrier. New patrols moved with silent precision, their steps echoing through the grand halls at all hours. Advanced surveillance systems, previously discreet, became overtly visible, their cold, unblinking eyes watching every corner, every approach. Sophia was rarely, if ever, out of Kane's sight or Marco's. His demanding presence, once a suffocating weight, now felt like a palpable shield. He was building a literal fortress around her, his focus entirely, ferociously on her safety. She watched him, her eyes following his every move, every command he issued. He was a force of nature, his ruthlessness honed to a terrifying edge, all of it directed at ensuring her survival. Her questions, once simmering beneath the surface, about her freedom, about her future, vanished. They were luxuries she could not afford, distant concerns in the face of this immediate, overwhelming danger. She understood now, with a clarity that both terrified and anchored her, that the threat was real, imminent, and only Kane possessed the power, the will, and the absolute ruthlessness to keep her safe. Sophia no longer questioned his authority. She clung to it like a lifeline. His harsh commands, his unwavering control were not shackles but safeguards. When he told her to stay in her room, she stayed. When he instructed her to eat, she ate. Her obedience became less a forced act of submission and more an instinct, a primal understanding that her survival was inextricably linked to his word, his will. She trusted him, not in the soft, gentle way one trusts a friend, but in the stark, absolute way a small, vulnerable creature trusts the formidable predator who has chosen to protect it. His presence, immense and dominating, became her anchor in the escalating storm. When he entered a room, the air shifted, the tension eased, because she knew that with him, she was untouchable. She would sit in the grand library, sketching, and often Kane would be there, a dark, imposing figure at his enormous desk, his attention divided between his work and the subtle monitoring of her presence. She felt his gaze, heavy and possessive, and instead of fear, a strange sense of calm would settle over her. She was his, and because she was his, she would be safe. It was a terrifying, addictive truth, and in the heart of the Mafia King's fortress, Sophia Reed, the girl sold at auction, began to truly understand the protective power of absolute dominion. The whispers escalated into undeniable roars just beyond the mansion's formidable walls. Sophia heard the subtle shifts in the guards' patrols, the hushed, urgent tones of Marco's phone calls, the way Kane's jaw would clench, his eyes hardening to chips of granite. The rival groups, driven by a furious desperation to reclaim their lost prize and challenge Kane's authority, were making increasingly bold attempts. Probes at the mansion's outer defenses, small, calculated intrusions that sent ripples of tension through the heavily guarded estate, were met with swift, brutal retaliation. Word would filter back, fragments of information about rival strongholds dismantled, about messages sent in blood and fire. Kane's men moved like silent, deadly shadows in the night, answering every challenge with a force that left no room for misinterpretation. The air in the mansion was a constant hum of danger, a palpable tension that vibrated just beneath the surface of its opulent calm. Sophia, now acutely aware of the external threats, found herself clinging to Kane's presence with a new, almost desperate need. Her world had shrunk to the confines of his protection, and the idea of being outside that shield was a terror she couldn't contemplate. He, in turn, kept her closer than ever. She found herself spending hours in his sprawling study, a vast room dominated by a massive dark wood desk and towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. He worked there, a formidable, imposing figure, his commands delivered in a low, unwavering voice, his attention constantly divided between the intricate web of his empire and the subtle monitoring of her presence. She would sit in a plush armchair, sketching quietly, her charcoal moving across the paper, but her senses were entirely attuned to him. She watched him, mesmerized and terrified, as he took calls, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, his face a mask of cold fury. She saw the ruthlessness required of him, the brutal decisions he had to make to maintain his power, to protect his territory. It was a terrifying spectacle, a glimpse into a world she could never truly understand, yet she knew that every harsh word, every cold command, every violent action was ultimately aimed at her survival. His demanding nature, once a source of her fear, now felt like a desperate, fierce grip on her, ensuring her continued existence. And she didn't fight it. There was no longer anything within her that wanted to fight his will, not when his will was her absolute safety. She listened to the cadence of his voice, the way his breath would sometimes hitch, the subtle tension in his broad shoulders. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hand when he finally put down a receiver after a particularly grueling call. He was constantly alert, always planning, always anticipating the next move of his enemies. He carried an immense burden, the weight of his entire empire, and now the added, precious weight of her safety. For the first time, Sophia felt a flicker of something akin to empathy for him. It was a strange, unsettling emotion, born from the stark reality of her situation. He was her captor, her king, the man who held her fate in his powerful hands. But he was also the only barrier between her and utter annihilation. He was the one who stood against the storm, absorbing every blow, deflecting every threat. He was a monster. Yes, but he was her monster, and in his formidable strength, she found not just protection, but a profound, almost addictive sense of belonging. His dark, dominant world had become her sanctuary, and in his fierce, unyielding control, she was finally, irrevocably safe. The mansion hummed with an unusual energy, a restless undercurrent that even Sophia, tucked away in her lavish room, could feel. The threats from the outside world had intensified, growing bolder, more desperate. Kane's response had been to tighten the fortress around her, making her world smaller, more impenetrable. But he was not a man to simply hide. He was a man who commanded, who asserted, who marked his territory with an unyielding hand. One afternoon, Kane stood in her doorway, a dark, imposing silhouette against the light of the hall. His gaze, heavy and unreadable, swept over her, a silent command for her attention. "Tonight," he stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "You will accompany me." Sophia's heart gave a nervous lurch, an outing. The thought filled her with a familiar dread, a fear of the unknown, of the world beyond Kane's carefully constructed walls. She knew this wouldn't be for her enjoyment. It was for him. It was a declaration. She simply nodded, her throat tight, a silent submission that felt both terrifying and strangely inevitable. Hours later, the silent maids, efficient and deferential, dressed her in a gown of deep emerald silk, its fabric cool and luxurious against her skin. It was a dress designed to turn heads, to command attention, a stark contrast to the simple clothes she was used to. Jewels, heavy and glittering, were placed at her throat, her wrists, her ears. She felt less like a woman and more like an exquisite doll, meticulously prepared for display. The final touch was the velvet collar, the one bearing Kane's crest, now a familiar, comforting weight against her skin, subtle beneath the jewels, but undeniably present. It was a mark, a symbol, a silent shout to the world that she belonged to him. It was a cage, yes, but a gilded one, a public proclamation of ownership that also served as her ultimate protection. The armored car, sleek and black, moved silently through the rain-washed streets, its tinted windows obscuring the world outside. Sophia sat beside Kane, her body rigid with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, burgeoning sense of purpose. He was a solid, unyielding presence, radiating a dangerous calm that both intimidated and grounded her. His hand, large and powerful, rested casually on his thigh, but she felt its unspoken command, its promise of absolute control. They arrived at a grand, brightly lit building, its entrance swarming with flashing cameras and a sea of impeccably dressed people. The air crackled with excitement, a stark contrast to the quiet tension in their car. As Kane stepped out, his towering figure immediately drew every eye, a ripple of hushed awe and fear spreading through the crowd. He was a king in his element, a force of nature. He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing before his hand settled firmly on the small of her back. The touch was possessive, a silent claim that sent a jolt through her, but also, paradoxically, a wave of profound safety. He guided her forward, his hand an unyielding anchor, steering her through the throng. Her breath hitched, the sheer number of eyes on her overwhelming. She felt like every gaze was a physical touch, probing, dissecting. But Kane's hand was a shield, his body a formidable wall. He moved with an effortless grace that belied his immense power, his head held high, his expression cold and unyielding. Every step she took was dictated by his presence, by the subtle pressure of his hand, and in her obedience she found a strange, compelling peace. They moved through the opulent ballroom, a symphony of hushed conversations and clinking glasses. Men and women, powerful and dangerous in their own right, turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, respect, and thinly veiled fear. Sophia felt the weight of their scrutiny, the whispers that followed in their wake. She was the girl from the auction, the one who had made the Volkov devil bleed money. She was the center of every gaze, the subject of every unspoken question. Then Kane would introduce her, his voice a low, commanding rumble that silenced all doubt. "My queen," he would state, his eyes never leaving hers, his grip on her back tightening imperceptibly. It was not a gentle introduction, but a public declaration of ownership, a defiant challenge to anyone who dared to question his claim. He was marking his territory, leaving no room for argument, no space for defiance. Sophia, though still overwhelmed, found herself walking with a newfound composure. She met the stares, not with defiance but with a quiet acceptance of her role. She understood now. This grand, terrifying display of dominance was her ultimate protection. Every possessive touch, every public declaration, every cold, unyielding glance he cast at those who looked too long was a fortress built around her. She felt the eyes of the underworld on her, sharp and predatory, but the most powerful gaze was Kane's, unwavering and possessive, a silent, absolute promise that in his dominion she was utterly, irrevocably safe. She was his queen, and in that terrifying, exhilarating truth she found her peace. The mansion hummed with an unusual energy, a restless undercurrent that even Sophia, tucked away in her lavish room, could feel. The threats from the outside world had intensified, growing bolder, more desperate. Kane's response had been to tighten the fortress around her, making her world smaller, more impenetrable. But he was not a man to simply hide. He was a man who commanded, who asserted, who marked his territory with an unyielding hand. One afternoon, Kane stood in her doorway, a dark, imposing silhouette against the light of the hall. His gaze, heavy and unreadable, swept over her, a silent command for her attention. "Tonight," he stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the quiet room, "you will accompany me." Sophia's heart gave a nervous lurch. An outing. The thought filled her with a familiar dread, a fear of the unknown, of the world beyond Kane's carefully constructed walls. She knew this wouldn't be for her enjoyment. It was for him. It was a declaration. She simply nodded, her throat tight. A silent submission that felt both terrifying and strangely inevitable. Hours later, the silent maids, efficient and deferential, dressed her in a gown of deep emerald silk, its fabric cool and luxurious against her skin. It was a dress designed to turn heads, to command attention, a stark contrast to the simple clothes she was used to. Jewels, heavy and glittering, were placed at her throat, her wrists, her ears. She felt less like a woman and more like an exquisite doll, meticulously prepared for display. The final touch was the velvet collar, the one bearing Cain's crest, now a familiar, comforting weight against her skin, subtle beneath the jewels but undeniably present. It was a mark, a symbol, a silent shout to the world that she belonged to him. It was a cage, yes, but a gilded one. A public proclamation of ownership that also served as her ultimate protection. The armored car, sleek and black, moved silently through the rain-washed streets, its tinted windows obscuring the world outside. Sophia sat beside Cain, her body rigid with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, burgeoning sense of purpose. He was a solid, unyielding presence, radiating a dangerous calm that both intimidated and grounded her. His hand, large and powerful, rested casually on his thigh, but she felt its unspoken command, its promise of absolute control. They arrived at a grand, brightly lit building, its entrance swarming with flashing cameras and a sea of impeccably dressed people. The air crackled with excitement, a stark contrast to the quiet tension in their car. As Cain stepped out, his towering figure immediately drew every eye, a ripple of hushed awe and fear spreading through the crowd. He was a king in his element, a force of nature. He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, before his hand settled firmly on the small of her back. The touch was possessive, a silent claim that sent a jolt through her, but also, paradoxically, a wave of profound safety. He guided her forward, his hand an unyielding anchor, steering her through the throng. Her breath hitched, the sheer number of eyes on her overwhelming. She felt like every gaze was a physical touch, probing, dissecting, but Cain's hand was a shield, his body a formidable wall. He moved with an effortless grace that belied his immense power, his head held high, his expression cold and unyielding. Every step she took was dictated by his presence, by the subtle pressure of his hand, and in her obedience she found a strange, compelling peace. They moved through the opulent ballroom, a symphony of hushed conversations and clinking glasses. Men and women, powerful and dangerous in their own right, turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, respect, and thinly veiled fear. Sophia felt the weight of their scrutiny, the whispers that followed in their wake. She was the girl from the auction, the one who had made the Volkov devil bleed money. She was the center of every gaze, the subject of every unspoken question. Then Cain would introduce her, his voice a low, commanding rumble that silenced all doubt. "My queen," he would state, his eyes never leaving hers, his grip on her back tightening imperceptibly. It was not a gentle introduction, but a public declaration of ownership, a defiant challenge to anyone who dared to question his claim. He was marking his territory, leaving no room for argument, no space for defiance. Sophia, though still overwhelmed, found herself walking with a newfound composure. She met the stairs, not with defiance, but with a quiet acceptance of her role. She understood now. This grand, terrifying display of dominance was her ultimate protection. Every possessive touch, every public declaration, every cold, unyielding glance he cast at those who looked too long, was a fortress built around her. She felt the eyes of the underworld on her, sharp and predatory, but the most powerful gaze was Cain's, unwavering and possessive, a silent, absolute promise that in his dominion she was utterly, irrevocably safe. She was his queen, and in that terrifying, exhilarating truth she found her peace. The uneasy quiet that had settled over the mansion after Cain's public display was shattered abruptly. Sophia felt it first in the sudden, sharp tension of the guards, their faces grim, their movements more urgent. Then came the distant sounds, not directly audible, but felt through the very foundations of the old house. A low, guttural rumble that vibrated beneath her feet. The faint echo of shouts carried on the wind, the distant, unmistakable crackle of gunfire. The rival cartel, enraged by Kane's defiance, had launched a direct assault on one of his key warehouses, a clear, brutal message that they were coming for her. Sophia's breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't the wild, uncontrolled panic of the auction. It was a different kind of fear, sharp and focused. She was the reason for this escalation, the prize they desperately sought. It wasn't a vague, distant threat anymore. It was a siege, and she was at its heart. Kane moved through the mansion like a storm, his presence growing even more formidable, colder, more ruthless. Sophia watched him, mesmerized by his transformation. His jaw was set, his eyes chips of glacial ice, burning with a terrifying resolve. He issued commands in a voice that brooked no argument, his words slicing through the air with the precision of a sharpened blade. Marco, his lieutenant, moved with frantic efficiency at his side, relaying information, receiving orders. Kane's response was swift and brutal, a terrifying demonstration of his absolute power. Sophia didn't see the violence directly, but she saw its fallout, heard the reports filtering through the mansion's walls. The enemy's warehouse, the target of their audacious attack, had been decimated. Their operations, their personnel, a significant part of their strength, simply ceased to exist. Kane was systematically dismantling them, leaving no doubt about his deadly commitment, his unwavering resolve to protect what was his. Every violent reprisal, every ruthless command was a shield thrown around her, proving the terrifying lengths he would go to ensure her safety. Sophia, witnessing the brutal fallout of his resolve, found a strange, unsettling calm settling over her. She was not a fighter, she knew that. Her hands, meant for charcoal and paint, were useless in this world of violence and power. But she was his, and that fact in this moment was her ultimate protection. She stood by him, a quiet, steadfast presence amidst the chaos, her terror a dull thrum beneath a newfound certainty. When he would return to his study, his eyes still burning with the aftermath of his wrath, Sophia would simply be there. She didn't speak, didn't question. She would simply offer him a glass of water, or quietly resume her sketching in the armchair, her presence a silent, unwavering anchor in the storm of his world. She didn't try to comfort him in the conventional sense. She knew he didn't need it. What he needed was her unwavering trust, her absolute obedience, her silent acceptance of his dominion. She followed his every instruction without question, her compliance no longer a forced act, but an instinct. If he told her to stay in her room, she did. If he told her to eat, she ate. Her trust in him was absolute, born not of affection, but of the stark, undeniable truth that he was the only one capable of standing between her and the abyss. He was her king, and in his formidable power, in his ruthless protection, she found her unwavering peace. The uneasy quiet that followed Kane's brutal retaliation was heavier, more suffocating than the clamor of conflict. The mansion, once bustling with the grim efficiency of men preparing for battle, now settled into a tense, watchful silence. Every corner was monitored, every shadow scrutinized. Sophia felt the heightened state of alert in the very air she breathed, in the hushed tones of the guards, in the almost imperceptible shifts of their patrol routes. It was a silence that spoke of an impending storm, a menacing lull before a final, decisive confrontation. Kane never left her side for long. He was an almost constant presence in her periphery, in the study, in the grand dining hall, even in the library, where she sometimes retreated with her sketch pads. His immense form was a formidable anchor in the swirling uncertainty, a demanding assurance that radiated power. She felt his gaze, heavy and possessive, sweep over her frequently. A silent check that she was where she belonged, safe within his immediate sphere of influence. In his proximity, even as the world outside threatened to ignite, Sophia found a strange, almost addictive sense of calm. His control, once a source of terror, had become her ultimate shield. She found herself subconsciously leaning into his presence, her entire being attuned to his formidable strength. In these tense moments, a deeper, more profound connection began to forge between them, one born not of words, but of shared silence and unspoken understanding. Sophia, seeking solace from the oppressive weight of the waiting, turned to her art with renewed fervor. Her charcoal flew across the paper, capturing the intricate details of the mansion, the play of light through ancient windows, anything to keep her mind from spiraling into dread. But increasingly, her eyes were drawn to Cain. She watched him as he worked, the cold precision of his movements, the formidable intelligence in his eyes, the sheer, unyielding power that emanated from his very being. She saw his strength, yes, but also the shadowed intensity that lurked beneath the surface, the immense burden he carried for his empire and for her. One afternoon, as Cain sat at his desk, engrossed in a stack of documents, his profile stark and powerful against the backdrop of the stormy sky, Sophia found her hand moving of its own accord. She began to sketch him, not just his features, but the essence of his presence. She captured the sharp line of his jaw, the heavy brow, the brooding intensity of his eyes that seemed to hold both immense danger and a strange, protective depth. She worked with a quiet focus, pouring all her observations, all her complex emotions, fear, gratitude, an unsettling sense of belonging, into each stroke. It was a raw, honest portrayal, a glimpse into the king she saw, the man who had become her world. When she was finished, she held the sketch, her heart thrumming with a mix of apprehension and pride. It was a part of her soul, laid bare. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she approached his desk. Presenting it felt like an act of immense vulnerability, a silent offering. Cain looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable, settling on her. He didn't speak, simply waited. Sophia held out the sketch, her arm outstretched, her gaze searching his for any flicker of reaction. He took it from her, his large fingers brushing hers, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her. He studied the drawing, his expression unreadable, his stillness absolute. Sophia held her breath, her chest tight. Then, slowly, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a softening, a rare tenderness, crossed his face. His eyes lifted from the sketch, meeting hers, and for a long moment, the heavy silence of the study was filled with a profound, unspoken understanding. In that shared glance, her fear of him receded, replaced by a deep, affirming sense of acceptance. He saw her, truly saw her, and did not reject her offering. Beyond the mansion's walls, Cain's intelligence network worked tirelessly, a vast, unseen web of information. Sophia didn't need to be told the details. She felt the subtle shift in the air. The way Marco's reports became more frequent, more focused. They were pinpointing the location and leadership of the remaining trafficking ring and the rival cartel. The lull was about to break. The next confrontation was imminent, a final, brutal reckoning. Sophia knew this with a quiet certainty, but the knowledge no longer paralyzed her. She was Cain's, and because she was his, she would face whatever came, anchored by his formidable power, confident in his unwavering, ruthless protection. The lull in the mansion was a deception, a taut string pulled to its breaking point. Sophia felt it in the way Cain moved, a predatory stillness that preceded a storm. He had been a whirlwind of strategic commands, his voice a low, dangerous growl over hushed calls, his attention consumed by the intricate dance of his empire. She understood, with a chilling certainty, that he was not just reacting to the enemy, he was orchestrating their downfall. He was setting a trap. She pieced it together from fragments. Hushed conversations between Marco and Kane, maps spread across his study desk, new patrol routes for men leaving the mansion in the dead of night. Kane was using a decoy, a carefully placed lure of his own assets, to draw the enemy out. They wanted her, the prize that had made the Volkov devil bleed, and Kane was using that ravenous desire against them. He was anticipating their every move, laying a snare to corner them, to annihilate them. His ruthlessness, once a terrifying unknown, was now a source of profound, almost dizzying certainty. He would not lose. He would not allow her to be taken. Sophia remained within the mansion's fortified walls, a quiet, watchful presence. She understood her role implicitly. She was the prize, the very reason for this brutal game, the motivation that drove both Kane and his enemies. There was no defiance in her, no desperate longing for escape. Her courage wasn't a roar, but a deep, unwavering stillness. She found strength not in her own meager will, but in her absolute devotion to Kane, in her certainty in his plan. Her life, her very being, was now inextricably linked to his power, and she accepted it not as a weakness, but as a profound truth. She was his, and his plan was her salvation. The air in the mansion thickened as the hour of confrontation drew near. Kane sought her out in the grand library, where she sat sketching, her hands moving with a practiced calm that belied the frantic beat of her heart. He stood before her, immense and unyielding, casting a long shadow across her paper. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a singular focus, a dangerous intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. "I am leaving," he stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through her, demanding her full attention. "The trap is set. I will finish this." Sophia looked up, her charcoal falling silent. Her throat tightened, a wave of apprehension washing over her. She knew the danger he faced, the brutal world he was about to plunge into, but she also knew his power, his terrifying capability. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out, not to touch, but to cup her chin, his thumb brushing lightly, possessively, against her jaw. The contact was a jolt, a silent claim that both anchored and exhilarated her. His gaze bore into hers, absolute and unwavering. "You will stay here," he commanded, his voice deep and stern, emphasizing absolute obedience. "You will not leave this room. You will not open the door for anyone but Marco. Do you understand?" Sophia nodded, her eyes wide, locked on his. "Yes, Kane," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her compliance was not a choice, it was an instinct, a primal need to obey the one who held her safety in his formidable hands. He searched her eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher, a raw, unspoken promise, crossing his hard features. His thumb tightened almost imperceptibly on her chin, a possessive reassurance. "Stay here," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, powerful growl. He filled with an intensity that made her entire body hum. "Stay safe. I am coming back for you." Then he released her, turning with a swift, decisive movement. His imposing figure moved towards the heavy library doors, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows of the hall. Sophia watched him go, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was alone, but not truly alone. She was under his command, under his protection, waiting for her king to return. His words, "I am coming back for you," echoed in her mind, a powerful, demanding promise that filled her with an unsettling yet profound sense of safety. The lull in the mansion stretched, thin and brittle, after Kane's departure. Sophia sat in the library, the sketch of his formidable profile clutched in her hand, but her artistic focus had completely vanished. The vast room, usually a sanctuary of quiet, now felt like a hollow shell, amplifying every creak of the old house, every distant rumble of thunder. She imagined him out there, a force unleashed, his wrath a tangible storm against his enemies. She could almost feel the brutal efficiency of his movements, the cold, unyielding precision of his commands as he descended upon the enemy's hideout, her king, fighting for her, eliminating every threat. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She trusted him, completely, implicitly. Her belief in his power was absolute. But the silence from the outside was deafening, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound of the world beyond the mansion's walls. She pictured the chaos, the violence, the ruthless confrontation he had gone to meet, and a shiver ran through her. Her delicate hands felt useless, her gentle spirit ill-equipped for such a world. Yet she was irrevocably bound to it, to him. She rose, the sketch still pressed tightly in her hand, and began to pace. The plush rug muffled her steps, but her mind was a whirlwind of frantic thoughts. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every flicker of candlelight on the grand portraits seemed to hold a silent judgment. She walked to the tall windows, peering out into the stormy night, seeing nothing but the relentless rain lashing against the glass, blurring the world into an indistinct, threatening landscape. Her entire being was focused on his return, a primal, all-consuming need for his formidable presence to once again anchor her. She needed to feel his power, his control, his absolute dominion, to know that he was safe, and that she, by extension, was safe within his formidable shield. The mansion's security, already tighter than ever, became a palpable, almost suffocating presence. Guards moved with a new urgency, their faces grim, their eyes constantly sweeping the opulent halls. Marco, his jaw set, barked low commands into a secure phone, his gaze constantly flicking to Sophia, a silent reassurance that even in Kane's absence, she was still under relentless watch. Then a subtle shift occurred, an almost imperceptible change in the air, a sharpening of the already taut tension. Sophia felt it before she heard anything concrete. It was a ripple through the guards, a sudden collective stiffening of their shoulders, a quick knowing exchange of glances. The enemy, cornered and facing heavy losses from Kane's brutal assault, was making a final desperate move. They were coming for her. A new set of frantic whispers began to spread through the mansion, hushed and urgent. Sophia caught fragments. Perimeter breach, small team, distraction. Her blood ran cold. They weren't coming for Kane. They were coming for her. The enemy, knowing Kane was distracted by the battle he had initiated, was exploiting the opportunity, sending a specialized team to breach the mansion's defenses, intent on snatching her, the ultimate prize. Sophia pressed herself against the cold stone of the wall, her breath catching in her throat. The terror, raw and visceral, clawed at her. She was no longer just waiting for Kane's return. She was now the immediate target. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her safety, her entire existence, was now hanging by a thread, and Kane, her protector, was not here. He was out there, unleashing his wrath, unaware that the very thing he fought for was now directly under siege. She was alone, truly alone, with only the formidable walls of the mansion and Kane's loyal but finite men between her and the abyss. A new wave of fear, colder and sharper, washed over her, born of the enemy's desperation and the terrifying thought of being separated from her king. The lull in the mansion stretched thin and brittle after Kane's departure. Sophia sat in the library, the sketch of his formidable profile clutched in her hand, but her artistic focus had completely vanished. The vast room, usually a sanctuary of quiet, now felt like a hollow shell, amplifying every creak of the old house, every distant rumble of thunder. She imagined him out there, a force unleashed, his wrath a tangible storm against his enemies. She could almost feel the brutal efficiency of his movements, the cold, unyielding precision of his commands as he descended upon the enemy's hideout. Her king, fighting for her, eliminating every threat. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She trusted him completely, implicitly. Her belief in his power was absolute. But the silence from the outside was deafening, a heavy blanket that smothered every sound of the world beyond the mansion's walls. She pictured the chaos, the violence, the ruthless confrontation he had gone to meet, and a shiver ran through her. Her delicate hands felt useless, her gentle spirit ill-equipped for such a world. Yet she was irrevocably bound to it, to him. She rose, the sketch still pressed tightly in her hand, and began to pace. The plush rug muffled her steps, but her mind was a whirlwind of frantic thoughts. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every flicker of candlelight on the grand portrait seemed to hold a silent judgment. She walked to the tall windows, peering out into the stormy night, seeing nothing but the relentless rain lashing against the glass, blurring the world into an indistinct, threatening landscape. Her entire being was focused on his return, a primal, all-consuming need for his formidable presence to once again anchor her. She needed to feel his power, his control, his absolute dominion, to know that he was safe, and that she, by extension, was safe within his formidable shield. The mansion's security, already tighter than ever, became a palpable, almost suffocating presence. Guards moved with a new urgency, their faces grim, their eyes constantly sweeping the opulent halls. Marco, his jaw set, barked low commands into a secure phone, his gaze constantly flicking to Sophia, a silent reassurance that even in Kane's absence, she was still under relentless watch. Then a subtle shift occurred, an almost imperceptible change in the air, a sharpening of the already taut tension. Sophia felt it before she heard anything concrete. It was a ripple through the guards, a sudden collective stiffening of their shoulders, a quick knowing exchange of glances. The enemy, cornered and facing heavy losses from Kane's brutal assault, was making a final desperate move. They were coming for her. A new set of frantic whispers began to spread through the mansion, hushed and urgent. Sophia caught fragments. Perimeter breach, small team, distraction. Her blood ran cold. They weren't coming for Kane. They were coming for her, the enemy. Knowing Kane was distracted by the battle he had initiated, was exploiting the opportunity, sending a specialized team to breach the mansion's defenses, intent on snatching her, the ultimate prize. Sophia pressed herself against the cold stone of the wall, her breath catching in her throat. The terror, raw and visceral, clawed at her. She was no longer just waiting for Kane's return. She was now the immediate target. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her safety, her entire existence, was now hanging by a thread, and Kane, her protector, was not here. He was out there, unleashing his wrath, unaware that the very thing he fought for was now directly under siege. She was alone, truly alone, with only the formidable walls of the mansion and Kane's loyal, but finite, men between her and the abyss. A new wave of fear, colder and sharper, washed over her, born of the enemy's desperation and the terrifying thought of being separated from her king. The distant rumble of thunder that had been a constant companion to the rain now intensified, growing closer, more menacing. Then the alarms blared, a piercing, electronic shriek that ripped through the quiet opulence of the mansion, echoing through every hall, every room. Sophia gasped, her hands flying to her ears. Shouts erupted, closer now, the frantic sounds of a struggle. Kane's personal guards, who had been strategically positioned around her, moved with lightning speed, surrounding her, their bodies forming an immediate protective circle. "Stay behind us, Sophia!" Marco's voice, usually so controlled, was sharp with urgency as he pushed her further into the library's deepest corner. The sounds of breaking glass, of fierce, close-quarters combat, echoed from the outer halls. The fortress was breached, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape. She felt the impact of bodies, the grunts of effort, the sharp smell of adrenaline and fear. She was protected, yes, but the walls were crumbling around them. Through the chaos, she heard Marco bark into his comms, his words sharp. "They're trying to take her to the docks, old warehouse near the shipping lanes." The words, meant for Kane, pierced through Sophia's terror, a chilling clarity. They knew. Kane knew. He would be coming, but would he be fast enough? The guards fought with a ferocious loyalty, a testament to their king's hold over them, but the attackers were relentless, desperate. They were a small, specialized team, swift and brutal, their movements precise. One of Kane's men crumpled, another was thrown back with a sickening thud. The circle around Sophia buckled, then broke. Rough hands, not Marco's, not Kane's, seized her. Sophia screamed, a raw, desperate sound, her voice thin against the din of the alarms and the intensifying storm. She fought with a strength she didn't know she possessed, not just for her own life, but because she knew the fury her capture would unleash in Kane. She thrashed, kicked, clawed, but it was useless. She was a gentle creature, overpowered by men trained for violence. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her, dragging her away from the dwindling protection of Kane's men. She caught a last glimpse of Marco, his face a mask of rage and desperation as he tried to fight his way back to her before she was pulled, half carried, half dragged through the fractured defenses. The cold, wet air of the New Orleans night slammed into her as they burst out of the mansion. The rain had intensified into a furious thunderstorm, lashing down in sheets, blurring the world into a chaotic mess of dark shapes and blinding flashes of lightning. She was pushed into a waiting van, thrown onto its cold metal floor. The door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The vehicle roared to life, speeding away, carrying her back into the abyss, back to the monsters Kane had saved her from, as the storm raged, mirroring the terror in her soul. The cold, damp air of the abandoned warehouse bit at Sophia's exposed skin, making her shiver uncontrollably. The rain hammered against the corrugated iron roof, a deafening roar that swallowed all other sounds, save for the frantic pounding of her own heart. She was shoved roughly into the center of the vast, shadowy space, surrounded by the men who had snatched her, their faces grim and triumphant in the dim, sporadic light filtering from a single flickering bulb high above. They were desperate, she realized, and that made them even more dangerous. One of them, a bulky man with a cruel sneer, kept her pressed against his side, his arm a vice around her waist, using her as a shield, a cruel tether to prevent Kane's pursuit. Then a sound, distinct even over the storm's fury, ripped through the warehouse. It was the screech of tires, too fast, too violent for the slick ground. The heavy metal door at the far end burst inward with a deafening crash, tearing from its hinges. Framed against the raging tempest outside, a silhouette of immense power filled the opening. Kane. He burst into the warehouse, his presence a physical shockwave that seemed to momentarily quiet the storm inside Sophia's chest. His eyes, even from a distance, were feral, burning with a rage so potent it felt like a living thing, mirroring the chaos of the New Orleans night. He saw her, pinned against the man, terrified but still defiant, still Sophia. A primal scream, raw and guttural, tore from Kane's throat, a sound of unleashed fury that sent a shiver down Sophia's spine, a sound that promised absolute annihilation. He was a whirlwind of violence, a force of nature even more terrifying than the storm. He didn't just enter, he exploded. Shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Men screamed. He moved with impossible speed, his massive frame a blur of dark intent, a relentless engine of destruction. Sophia could barely track his movements, only glimpses of his dark clothes, the glint of metal, the brutal efficiency of his attacks. He shot, He stabbed, he fought with a feral brutality that transcended human limits, fueled by a singular, consuming purpose, her. The man holding Sophia grunted, his grip tightening as Cain tore through his companions. She felt the vibrations of the impacts, the sickening thuds, the guttural cries. Cain was coming for her, cutting a path through every single obstacle. He reached them, his eyes locked on her, blazing with a terrifying intensity. He didn't hesitate. With a roar that vibrated through her bones, he shoved the man holding her, sending him sprawling. Before Sophia could even register her release, Cain was there, his massive body a sudden, unyielding wall, physically shielding her behind a stack of rusted crates. He put himself between her and the remaining traffickers, absorbing blows, deflecting shots, his every move a testament to his absolute will to protect her. She heard the crack of bone, the wet sound of a knife finding its target. But he never faltered, never moved from his position, his body a fortress for hers. Her fear was immense, but it was now directed entirely at the threats to him, not from him. She clung to his back, her small hands fisted in his dark coat. Feeling the tremor of his powerful muscles, the terrifying beat of his heart against her. In the chaos, a desperate trafficker, the last one standing, aimed a final wild shot directly at Sophia. Time seemed to slow. She saw the flash, the trajectory, the certain impact. But before she could even gasp, Cain moved with a speed that defied his size. He shoved her further behind the crates, his body twisting, and a searing pain exploded in his shoulder. The bullet meant for her found him. He staggered, a low grunt tearing from his lips, but he didn't fall. His eyes, still blazing with a terrifying protective fury, found the last man. A final, brutal roar, a swift, deadly move, and the threat was extinguished. The warehouse fell silent, save for the relentless drumming of the rain and the ragged sound of Cain's breathing. He stood over the fallen, his body bleeding, but his stance was triumphant, unyielding. He was broken, but he had won. Then, through the din of the storm, a new sound began to wail, growing rapidly closer, police sirens. Flashing blue and red lights painted fleeting patterns on the grimy walls, announcing official rescue. Hands reached for Sophia, unfamiliar, softer hands belonging to officers who had breached the warehouse, offering her escape, offering her freedom. She looked at them, then at Cain. He was bloody, his coat torn, his shoulder a raw, dark stain. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes, fixed on her, still held that fierce, possessive intensity. He was her king, her monster, her protector. He had taken a bullet for her, burned the world for her, kept her safe in a way no one ever had. Without a moment's hesitation, without a second thought, Sophia turned away from the outstretched hands, away from the promise of a life she no longer recognized. She threw herself against Cain, clinging to his blood-soaked shirt, burying her face against his chest. His powerful arm, though injured, instinctively wrapped around her, holding her tight. "I'm staying with my king," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion but resolute. "I'm staying with you." The words were not a plea, but a declaration. A total surrender, a profound acceptance of her place by his side in his dark, dangerous, utterly safe world. The police sirens had dissolved into a tense, hushed confrontation just outside the warehouse. Sophia, still clinging to Cain, felt the cold press of a gun against her temple as an officer tried to pull her away. But Cain's men, moving with chilling efficiency, swarmed the scene. Marco's voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the confusion, addressing the officers. His words laced with a subtle threat that was unmistakably Volkov. Sophia didn't understand the legal jargon, the rapid-fire exchanges, but she understood the absolute power behind it. Cain, even bleeding and injured, was still commanding, his gaze unwavering on her, a silent assurance that this, too, would be handled. When an officer, his face hardened with suspicion, turned to Sophia, urging her to speak, to tell them what these men had done to her, she didn't hesitate. She looked at Cain, his bloody shirt, the pain etched in his formidable features, and a fierce, protective loyalty surged through her. He had saved her, taken a bullet for her, burned the world for her. She would protect him now. Her voice, though still trembling, was clear, fueled by her devotion. She painted a picture of abduction, of terror, of the traffickers as the sole aggressors, of Cain as the unexpected, brutal savior who had intervened to save her from a fate worse than death. She omitted details, twisted truths, her words weaving a narrative that implicated the traffickers and, with chilling precision, allowed Cain to vanish from the official record, a phantom of justice. The officers, outmatched by Cain's formidable legal and underworld influence, were eventually forced to retreat, their suspicions silenced by a power far greater than their own. Sophia watched them go, a strange sense of vindication settling over her. In his dominion, even the law bent to his will. Back in the mansion, the world outside faded into a distant echo. Cain, pale and unyielding, was ushered into his personal medical wing, his shoulder wound more severe than Sophia had initially realized. She stayed by his side, a quiet, watchful presence. She watched the doctors work with deference, their movements precise, their hushed voices filled with respect for their dangerous patient. When they were finished, Cain, still formidable even in pain, dismissed them, his eyes, dark and heavy, settling on Sophia. He was her king, broken but triumphant. She approached him, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce devotion. His injuries were a stark reminder of his vulnerability, a rare, almost shocking glimpse beneath the impenetrable armor he wore. She saw the lines of pain around his mouth, the tremor in his hand as he tried to shift, but he never complained, never showed weakness. It only deepened her love, deepening her understanding of the sacrifice he had made. Sophia became his shadow, his quiet caregiver. She helped the silent maids change his dressings, her touch gentle and steady, her hands surprisingly strong as she supported his weight. She brought him his meals, ensuring he ate, sat silently as he worked through the pain, his commands still sharp, his mind still ruthless. She would smooth his brow, brush the dark hair from his face when sleep finally claimed him, her fingers lingering, a silent testament to her unwavering commitment. In these moments, she saw a side of him few, if any, ever witnessed, a man brought low yet still dominant, still powerful, and he, in turn, allowed her closeness, his gaze, though heavy, holding a silent acknowledgement of her strength, her devotion, her past fears of men, a lifetime of ingrained terror from the foster system, had completely dissolved, replaced by an unshakable faith in Cain. He was the one man who had never hurt her, the one man who would burn the world to keep her safe. She was no longer a captive, not truly. She was his chosen queen, not just by title, but by a profound, soul-deep acceptance. She understood now that her safety, her happiness, her entire world was inextricably intertwined with his power and protection. His dominance was not a cage, it was the foundation of her peace. She leaned into it, into him, finding solace in the absolute certainty of his will. The mansion, once a gilded prison, was now her sanctuary, her home, a testament to the fierce, protective love of the Mafia king. She was cherished, protected, and utterly, irrevocably his. Months later, the heavy New Orleans humidity felt less oppressive, the mansion's shadows less daunting. Sophia now spent her days in a new studio wing Cain had built for her, a soaring space flooded with the soft, ethereal light filtering through tall, arched windows that overlooked the churning Mississippi. It was a sanctuary, a dream made real, far grander than the tiny sunlit studio she had once secretly yearned for. Her brushes, once cheap and worn, now glided across canvases of pristine linen, each stroke a testament to a life she could never have imagined. This was his gift, his command, a silent insistence that her talent flourish under his formidable protection. Her vibrant canvases, once confined to the solitude of her room, now hung throughout the mansion, splashes of color and life against the dark, Gothic architecture. A stormy cityscape, a magnolia tree in full bloom, a haunting portrait of the river itself. Each piece, a beautiful, stark contrast to the opulence and shadows, a living symbol of her flourishing within his formidable domain. She was not just a presence here, she was an integral part of its very fabric, a queen whose art adorned her king's stronghold. New Orleans, a city that thrived on whispers and legends, now spoke of the mafia king who had taken an auction girl and crowned her an untouchable queen. The stories were laced with awe and fear, a testament to Cain's absolute power and his fierce, unyielding claim. Sophia felt the weight of those whispers when she ventured, always accompanied, beyond the mansion's walls, but they held no terror. Cain's men patrolled the grounds, their grim faces a constant reassurance, ensuring her peace, their very presence a formidable shield against any lingering threat. She was his, and therefore untouchable. Cain remained the powerful, demanding figure she had first encountered, his presence still capable of silencing a room, his commands absolute. He ruled his empire with an iron fist, his cold gaze missing nothing. Yet, in the quiet moments, Sophia witnessed a different side, a rare, almost tender contrast to his ruthless dominion. The only time his large, powerful hands were truly gentle was when he stood beside her in the studio, a paintbrush held awkwardly in his strong fingers, mimicking her strokes, or more often, when he would cup her face, his thumbs brushing softly against her skin. In those moments his eyes, usually so cold and unreadable, held a profound, possessive warmth. She felt like the most priceless work of art, cherished and adored, held in the hands of the only man who could ever truly protect her. She leaned into his touch, her eyes, once wide with fear, now filled with a deep, unwavering love and devotion. She had found absolute safety, not in freedom, but in his strength, in his absolute control, in the terrifying, exhilarating truth of being utterly claimed by her king. Her quiet dream of painting in a tiny studio had transformed into a grand, vibrant reality, a powerful living testament to the fierce, protective and possessive love of Cain Volkov. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romances.